Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and today's discussion is going to be about 9/11. I'm going to be travelling across quite vast territory with this, and I'm going to be bringing in interesting factors that people may not have thought of. But I think I might just start with my reaction to 9/11. I do remember where I was. I was in Canberra at the time. And I remember being absolutely shocked seeing planes crashing into buildings because this was like the United States. You know, you see war zones as a completely different thing. Suddenly, you're seeing these planes going into buildings, and it's completely shocking because you know people are in the buildings. So our humanity for each other comes up straight away. Then I found out that they'd bombed Afghanistan. Similar number of people were killed. I had an Afghan friend. He was horrified that his own people were targeted. This video is going to talk about the targeting of innocent civilians. We're also going to look at the bigger global picture around this and some very extremist perspectives that I think may well be related to this, because it's such a horrific crime. Any sort of murder of people, in my opinion, whether it be one or whether it be a million people, or whether we're even planning to depopulate the planet, when we look at dispassionately, pathologically making decisions to destroy a life, we step over a line. And that line is our humanity, which is naturally evoked to save life. The Hippocratic Oath in doctors is a pledge to save life. The soldiers who are seen as the heroes are the ones that save life. The people that rush into buildings in 9/11, the fire brigade there, were seen as heroes. The police who risk their lives when they actually save people, pulling people out of a car wrecks, etc. This evokes within all of us great love for those who save lives, because that could be me. That's what empathy does. Now, for those completely disconnected, and we're talking a serious mental health issue here, and it is, who create narratives around the justification for taking life. They concoct stories to say it's in the pursuit of some freedom, or it's in the pursuit of expanding democracy through violence. Both is an oxymoron. You cannot force democracy. It always is subject to a vote. It's sharing of power is what it really is. It's not the taking of power. It's not an occupation. It's not about industrial growth, etc., etc. So this video is going to explore firstly 9/11, and I'm going to go to my book, which is A Fool for Peace. You can download a free PDF. It's a 500-page book, and it actually is quite a kaleidoscope of subject matter, which I believe covers the peace spectrum. It also has ideas in it for how we can educate our population globally to actually put peace as the centre point of our civilization, rather than war mythologies, which have not resolved the problem of conflict on our planet. They've only escalated the problem, because more and more people seek revenge, more and more people feel hatred. So we're talking a very dark type of regime, or a dark type of ideology that is being normalised at this time. Those of us who are peacemakers will become more vocal at this time, because we can see where this is leading us. And there are solutions even to the issue of sustainability, which some are stating in part has been, let's say, exploited. Others are saying that people have actually created damage to the climate. Other perspectives are saying it's coming from cosmic events. Whatever perspective you come from, the climate is changing without a doubt. But we don't go and harm other people and call that a solution. It's not. It works against the very values of humanity, and there are always pathways out. But you have to look through a prism of values in order to see those pathways. What blindsides us is this constant reference to the intellect, this constant mapping out, this constant dispassionate viewing of human beings, and then saying that that's a rational solution. Well, it's not. It has to be social emotional. The emotional side is not irrational. The emotional side is part of emotional intelligence, which expands what you see. We're just not taught emotional intelligence because the feminine was shut down. For a large part of our history, the feminine voice has not been heard, and we have another way of seeing. And it's up to you. If you want to solve the problem, you have to start listening. And even if videos go for more than an hour, I suggest you sit and listen. Take the time, because these words are coming to you for a reason. So let's start with my book. I'm going to read excerpt out of the section on Helen Caldicott, so you're welcome to go there. So this is the section where I talk about the industrial military complex, and then I start talking about Michael Moore's film. She told me about the industrial military complex, a term I would later become more familiar with. She inquired if I knew about the Carlyle Group. I didn't. She then explained to me briefly who they were. I subsequently did some research and discovered the Carlyle Group is a private equity group in Washington that did leverage buyouts. Apparently, they had $170 billion in assets under management across 113 funds and 67 fund vehicles. They bought defence contractors such as United Defence in 1997. It turns out that the CEO, William Conway, was a former chairman of United Defence Industries and senior vice president of MCI Communications, in brackets MCI WorldCom. That was later plagued by financial scandals and bankruptcy. Interestingly, MCI's network was an integral part of the global internet backbone. I was surprised to see so many prominent members involved. This is in the Carlyle Group, such as George H. Bush, former US President, James Baker, former US Secretary of State, Frank Carlucci, former US Secretary of Defense, Arthur Levitt, Chairman Securities and Exchange Commission, John Major, former British Prime Minister, Fidel Ramos, former President of the Philippines, Thaksin Shinawatra, former Prime Minister of Thailand, Norman Pearlstein, editor of Time magazine. In respect to the business world, they had the current and former chairman and CEOs of General Motors, Lehman Brothers, Nielsen Australia, Power Corporation of Canada, Bundesbank, Global Finance, and so on. So these are the high-profile and high-powered people with Carlyle operations across the world. They are the third largest private equity firm in the world. The most fascinating part of this story is that the Carlyle Investor Conference took place on September 11, 2001. A member of the bin Laden family was in attendance as an investor. The family had invested $2 million in the Carlyle Group in 1995. The bin Laden family liquidated their assets October 2001. I wonder why. Michael Moore, and I'd just like to premise this by saying this person should win the Nobel Peace Prize. I had a look at Nobel Peace laureates the other day, and they're all political science people who I've not heard of. There have been some excellent peacemakers in this world that have not gained acknowledgement through the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'd just like to say that should be depoliticised. We need to actually inspire and encourage real peacemakers. These are the ones that are courageous, that come out and do their research. These are the ones that risk their lives for the greater good. They're the true peacemakers. Michael Moore's definitely one of them, and he's taken huge risks to produce the films he's produced. So I go on to talk about Michael Moore. He's an investigative journalist. He explained in his film Fahrenheit 9/11 that US airspace had been shut down after the September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and in Pennsylvania, thus transforming the United States into a no-fly zone. Not even the president's father could fly, apparently. He said after the airspace reopened, 6 chartered flights with 142 passengers, mostly Saudi Arabian nationals, departed from the United States between September 14 and 24. One flight, the so-called Bin Laden flight, departed the United States on September 20 with 26 passengers, most of them relatives of Osama bin Laden. On Moore's website, it is stated, Senator Byron Dorgan, we had some airplanes authorised at the highest levels of our government to fly to pick up Osama bin Laden's family members and others from Saudi Arabia and transport them out of the country. Narration. It turns out that the White House approved planes to pick up the bin Ladens and numerous other Saudis. At least 6 private jets and nearly 24 commercial planes carried the Saudis and the bin Ladens out of the US after September 13. Additional facts not mentioned in Fahrenheit 9/11 and sourced from Michael Moore's website included the following information. First, the US Customs and Border Protection documents released by the Department of Homeland Security under the FOIA February 24, 2004 lists says 162 Saudi nationals who flew out of the country between 9/11 and 9/15, 2001. There's a link in my book. Second, even though Fahrenheit does not make the allegation, on June 9, 2004, news reports confirm that 2 days after the September 11 attacks, with most of the nation's air traffic still grounded, a small jet landed at Tampa Airport, International Airport, picked up 3 young Saudi men and left. The men, one of them thought to be a member of the Saudi royal family, were accompanied by a former FBI agent and a former Tampa police officer on the flight to Lexington. The Saudis then took another flight out of the country. Moreover, for nearly 3 years, White House, aviation and law enforcement officials have insisted the flight never took place and have denied published reports and widespread internet speculation about its purpose. The terrorism panel, better known as the 9/11 Commission, said in April that it knew of 6 chartered flights with 142 people aboard, mostly Saudis, that left the United States between September 14 and 24. But it has said nothing about the Tampa flight. The 9/11 Commission, which has said the flights out of the United States were handled appropriately by the FBI, appears concerned with the handling of the Tampa flight. Most of the aircraft allowed to fly in US airspace on September 13 were empty airliners being ferried from the airports where they made quick landings on September 11. The reopening of airspace included paid charter flights, but not private, non-revenue flights. And after that, I've got Jean Heller, TIA now verifies flights of Saudis. The government has long denied that 2 days after the 9/11 attacks, the 3 were allowed to fly. So that's out of the St. Petersburg Times in 2004. Michael Moore interviewed an FBI agent in the film who said he thought it unusual that the planes were allowed to take off, since he assumed that the key suspects would have been Saudi nationals and the bin Laden family. In the film, Moore talked about the Saudi influence. The official Fahrenheit reader indicates that 85,000 high net worth Saudi invested $860 billion in American companies. Let's repeat that, $860 billion, pushing closer to $1 trillion in American companies, an average of 10 million a person, and a sum that is roughly equivalent to the gross domestic product of Spain. In terms of investments on Wall Street, $860 billion is roughly 6 or 7% of America. That's significant from the perspective of influence. It goes on to say the Saudi influence on US national interest of these wealthy oil barons is significant. If the amount invested is 7%, and this was suddenly withdrawn, it could conceivably crash the US economy. Therefore, if the Saudis are displeased, this can be their bargaining chip. I would consider this a threat to national security, sovereignty, and democracy. Moore indicated the complex relationship between the US government, the Bush family, the bin Laden family, the Saudi Arabian government, and the Taliban, spanning over 3 decades. Moore mentioned that the Saudi ambassador to the United States was known affectionately as Bandar Bush. So close was their association. Michael Moore was never sued for making these allegations, therefore one can only assume there was truth in his reporting. It appears the circle of the global elite have allegiances with their group that are far stronger than national interests or patriotism. Other information that corroborates the findings and links above is highlighted in research undertaken by a US journalist, Craig Unger, in his book, House of Bush, House of Sword, the secret relationship between the world's 2 most powerful dynasties. And the excerpt is as follows. Author Craig Unger exposes, among other things, how 140 mainly Saudi nationals were whisked out of the United States on private jets in the days immediately following 9/11, while no other commercial aircraft was allowed to leave the tarmac. Unger originally broke the story of the flights in an October 2003 Vanity Fair article. But in last week's Salon article, he lists the actual passenger manifests and showed how the authorization for the flights came from the highest levels of the White House and the intelligence agencies. Unger found that passengers on the flights included nearly 24 members of the bin Laden family, including Osama bin Laden's sister, and more ominously, a Saudi prince later identified by Abu Zubaydah, and that's Zubaidah. The captured al-Qaeda operative alleged to have planned the USS Cole attack as a fellow al-Qaeda terrorist. In other words, the US government aided the escape of a man who may have been directly involved in the 9/11 attacks. Unger's disclosures should have been front page news, but the story was all but ignored by the mainstream media. Last fall, while he was still working on his investigation, GNN met up with Unger in his Tribeca loft to discuss why so many people who should have been prime suspects were allowed to leave the US days after 9/11, why the press had failed to cover so many important 9/11 stories, and the larger question of where, as Greg Palast says, Bush family interests end and America's foreign policy begins. The following is an excerpt from that conversation. And I'll just say GNN, and then I'll say Craig Unger. GNN is the interviewer. Let's start off by asking what your current research is about and what led you into the whole genre of looking into what happened with the Saudis. Craig Unger, back in the 1980s, I had done work on the elder George Bush and his role in the Iran-Contra and Iran-Gate. And the piece I did for the New Yorker that I co-wrote, that appeared in 1992, just before the presidential election, took part in his secret role in Iran-Contra and in Iraq-Gate. And what I did that I think was a little unusual was I started looking at those not as two very separate episodes, but as part of a continuum. And what you saw in both of them too was that he had big roles with the Saudis. So when 9/11 happened, most people saw this coming, very much from out of the blue. The New York Times even published a book called Out of the Blue. That's how most Americans experienced it. For me, it was something quite different, and I began to look at the Bush family's role with the Saudis. My book is called House of Bush, House of Sword, and I started going back from Iran-Contra to Iraq-Gate. The BCCI scandal, which was a huge scandal involving a very corrupt bank called the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. That's BCCI. And it also involved Bush and the Saudis again. The Gulf War in 1991 again was a Bush and Saudi almost joint venture. The elder George Bush had a very close relationship with Prince Bandar, the longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States. And then you come right up to 9/11 and again you see that 15 out of 19 hijackers are Saudis. And of course President Bush is there. I started looking at the relationship in depth. And to many people it was seen as ironic that the bin Ladens had actually been investors in the Carlyle Group, this huge private equity firm with the Bushes. And they were actually present at the Carlyle Investment Conference on September 11. In fact, as I see it, nothing could have been less ironic that it was really part of a long-term relationship. Irony suggests something unexpected. The Bushes are oil men. The Saudis are about oil. It's not unexpected that they should have some relationship like this. GNN, in terms of global finance and oil, specifically, the world is a small place. There are only a few individual players in that arena. The Bushes are one and the Saudi sheiks are another. And American security really depends on those relationships. So was it surprising to find a man like George Bush Sr., who had a CIA history, involved with them? And do you think the American public was surprised to find out about that? Given the legacy of the Saudis and American interests, to what degree do American interests in securing oil reserves have to do with the way these relationships have been nurtured? Unger, he says, the Saudis are enormously important for several reasons. One is, it's not just that they have the largest oil reserves in the world. It's partly the ease with which they are able to extract oil that allows them to just turn on the spigot, and they can lower or raise the price of oil at their will. So in a certain way, we are enormously dependent on them, and having a close relationship with them has been a key part of oil, is a strategic resource for the United States. It's enormously important to us. We need that in some way, and we have to sort of deal with that in some way. So it's not surprising that we would turn to the Saudis for that. The question is being so addicted to cheap Saudi oil, have we not looked aggressively and have we turned a blind eye to their role in fostering terrorism? And when 9/11 happened, suddenly I think it became much more difficult to turn a blind eye, and you start to see this long-term relationship start to unravel. The House of Sword, the royal family, is a theocracy. They rule through an alliance with Wahhabi Islam. So there is no separation of church and state in Saudi Arabia. It is a very puritanical, fundamentalist version of Islam, and that in many ways has provided a breeding ground for terrorism. Now, in terms of what role they play in fostering terrorism, that's a very controversial and nuanced subject. But there's a spectrum of culpability. And when you talk to the Saudis, what most of them say, charity is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It is known as zakat, which means giving a certain amount of your income to charity. In the West, we call that tithing. A lot of that money, he says, has been funneled off to terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. But the Saudis will tell you, when you talk to them officially, that, gee, it's just like you're giving to the United Way. We can't control all of this. It goes through many, many countries. We lose control over it. We don't have a strong enough system. But there is nothing inherently wrong with it, nothing immoral going on. We're not doing this knowledgeably. That is probably true for a certain number of Saudis, they say. Now, this next bit's important as well. Another interesting association to point out here is the Project for a New American Century. Now, I might just premise this by saying that I came across this very, very early on in the piece, just after September 11, I think. But I remember getting a very deep insight quite quickly. And I'll read on and you'll get an insight as to why this is fundamental. So the New American Century, which was formed to promote American global leadership. Interesting names involved included Donald Rumsfeld, former US Secretary of Defense, Richard Perle, former US Assistant Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, neoconservative architect of the Bush policy in Iraq. I'm just going to repeat him. Paul Wolfowitz, neoconservative architect of the Bush policy in Iraq. And a cast of many more. The co-founder of this group was William Kristol, and that's Kristol, a neoconservative policy analyst and a regular commentator on Fox News. That's worth repeating. His name is William Kristol. He's the co-founder. He's a regular commentator on Fox News. That links to us in Australia. So what this highlights is that this group of neoconservatives, or neocons as they call them, had a twin agenda for a strong defence policy in the United States and free market capitalism, deregulation, unfettered market power. As a group, they were concerned about falling defence spending, and the perception that it would make the United States weaker. So this is the idea of might through weapons. They were aware that there were no real threats to the United States to justify an increase in defence spending. Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz and Perle are the names that come up in association with what was termed the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus refers to the IMF, World Bank, and US Treasury. So this is our financial bankers, global bankers. These persons formed part of the inner sanctum of the GW or George W. Bush administration. It seems that September 11 event was utilised to catalyse the war on terrorism and spurred on by the underlying mantra of endless wars, which gave weight to the argument for boosting defence spending the neoconservatives had been looking for. This ensured the United States defence spending increased, which proved a boon to the industrial military complex. My last reading of the statistics on the cost of war in Afghanistan and Iraq is estimated at between 4 to 6 trillion, 8 times normal global military spending, the US being the highest spender of all countries put together. I'm just adding to this now, I've also heard 14 trillion. The figures are usually a lot higher than what the estimates are. So this is defence spending. Be good to look into that in a bit more detail, all those that are providing material aid to that spending. which is creating this environment of terrorism. It's something for all of us to contemplate. So that's the increase in defence spending, according to these statistics, 4 to 6 trillion, which is an extraordinary amount of money into violence. This is a prime example of the lack of inner peace and what drives the conflicts. The key question always is, who really profits? So I'm going to leave that there from my book for contemplation. I was in the media at that time, around that time, just after that time actually, and I've interviewed many people. Andrew Wilkie was one of those people I interviewed as part of a group of journalists, and he was on the desk of the Office of National Assessment here in Australia. He was an analyst, intelligence analyst, and he came out very strongly as a whistleblower, making the case that there was no justification for us to go to war in Iraq. He said there was no threat to Australia with weapons of mass destruction. And there was also narratives around that time too of the politicisation of intelligence. I also had the opportunity to listen to Scott Witter, who I've talked about a bit lately, he's a former CIA operative, and he was the weapons inspector sent into Iraq, but he was there in a spying capacity. And he talked about being sent on all these expeditions to find weapons of mass destruction to discover that there was a policy that there will always be between, I think it was 8 and 12 weapons of mass destruction, whether there is or not. He saw himself being sent out. He realised that it was just furphies. This was not real. He realised that their weapons program had ended many years before. He recognised that the real intent behind the weapons inspections was regime change, and he actually narrowed that down to name change. I believe in the US Constitution. It's against the US Constitution to actually take out the head of state of another country. The issue of interference in other countries is a big issue for the United States to look at, also for Britain. All those powers that have been involved in affecting influence in the world through the projection of power. We have to create a world. I'm sort of hesitant to use the word order because I don't like the associations with order, new world order. We don't want that. That won't be coming, I might just state. We want a collaborative, empathetic world. I'll use the word union, but this is not associated with unions. This is just the literal word union or unity. We need to find a way to come together on the basis of values we all share in order to collectively solve problems that affect all of us. We have to start to reframe. I don't even want to use the word power, because the future world that I'm seeing right now has no power over in it. It's power within, and I've written poetry about power within or power over. When you come from a deeper respect for other human beings, when you are integrated emotionally, where you aren't denying the feeling aspect, when you see yourself in the other, which is what that integrated state of being enables, you will never harm that other. It's not possible. So when I'm saying this, I'm actually speaking to those people who have been mentioned in this, and I'm sending them great love. They might find that hard to understand, but I don't dislike anybody. I don't believe in causing them the same pain that they caused others. Others may want that, but I don't. I want to invite them to another way of seeing, to achieve what I do believe on a very, very deep level, they were seeking. I do feel that there was an attempt to find something higher in themselves. But because they're coming out of a distorted filter, now this can come from wealth too. When you've come from privilege and entitlement, where you've been taught on a very deep level, it's been normalized since childhood that you're superior. You're better than those people. We're better bred. We are more highly intelligent. That is why we've been rewarded by God. I'm going into the narrative that goes on within them as an implied thing as well. We are deserving. Now, there are blind spots that come out of that type of internal narrative of superiority over others. It blinds you to actually recognizing that that other is me. I'm coming from a universal perspective when I'm speaking like this, and because I'm integrated emotionally, my Real Hope program, if you want to look at my website, Worldpeacefull, double L, Worldpeacefull, FULL.com. You can go into school programs, go into anti-bullying, and you'll see Real Hope. Real hopes: responsibility, empathy, awareness, love, honesty, oneness, peace, enjoyment, and service. Real hopes is the model. Real hope is the program. These are universal values we all share, but you have to learn it experientially. You cannot learn it theoretically. Now, we all go into educational institutions and we learn everything theoretically. Therefore, we become detached. We see the world in concepts and objects. When you live deeply in an experiential experience, we have the highs and the lows, where it's more grounded, which is where the middle class actually takes people. The middle class is actually a very grounding space because you're not considered above it, you're not considered below it. You're just getting on with it, whatever it is you want to do. So in a sense, when people are treating you as equal, and in Australia we had a very strong egalitarian society, it enables you to see people as part of who you are. That friendship and mateship breaks down all those barriers here when you are grounded like that. So those who have this pathological mindset, and I say that with respect to those who may be listening to this because you believe you're right, although I'm sure you're more fearful these days because more narratives and whistleblowers are coming out. But this is the journey you've been on, and you have to confront fears just like the rest of us do. But rather than paying lawyers to set up lawsuits, rather than setting up smart cities to try and further control, to keep furthering these agendas. And at the same time, while the environment has been collapsing as an ecological crime against nature, those visions of that sense of having control over all of it and an assured abundance coming out of it is not going to materialise. It can't materialise because you do not know the laws of nature. I've talked in my videos about homeostasis. I've talked about peace as balance. Peace is not anti-war. Peace is just stipulating that the counterbalance to violence is peace. That's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out of the Second World War, is because of the massive carnage, the massive pain and harm that was caused through the violence of men believing they're defending something. Totalitarianism came up at that time with Hitler, who was really created out of the forced reparations from World War I by the European powers. So rather than people coming together and solving issues like poverty, people coming together and educating the whole person, such as the Steiner education in Montessori, which was far more holistic. And these are not lofty terms. These are ways and means of evolving our civilization so that it's more balanced. Now, when we come into balance, we naturally dissolve all these discriminations that have set one above the other, we start to naturally balance with the natural system. Now, as I've said in other videos, nature's discord, nature's tumultuous response is to us. The planet itself is alive, and the planet itself has senses. The planet itself is so sensitive that it changes in accordance to temperature, to the various changes in chemical compositions in the planetary ecology. The massive extraction of oil displaces the weight of the planet and the axis. The ignorance in which we pursue profit in order to maintain a lifestyle or to maintain an addiction reflects a disconnected state of consciousness that has no connection to the world that it exploits. So as we extract this oil in order to energize various technologies, when we already know that the Tesla free energy existed. In fact, Donald Trump's uncle, a university professor, was the one who had to look over Tesla's papers, I understand. Interesting connection. He invented the free energy. JP Morgan shut him down. He shut him down because you could not meter that energy. Now, I'm just going to move into some lateral stuff here a little bit in respect of the metering of energy, which is where the money is made, which keeps the lifestyles of the exceptionally rich in positions of power and influence. These oligarchies. I also want to make a quick allude to the fact that the Department of Energy is located within the Department of Defense. That's problematic. Problematic not only for the United States but the rest of the world, because these ventures into other countries that have oil reserves and then utilising other narratives as the reason why you're defeating terrorism or the reason why you're bringing democracy, when that clearly is not the case. And when we're hearing that the actual terrorism is the creation from within. And that's on a metaphysical level as well. The terror you feel within projects out onto the world. You see it in every other phase. So going back to the metering, the fact that JP Morgan, who still exists today, banking area, did not release that free energy technology, 0-point energy technology to the world because it couldn't be metered. And this is the capitalist system that perpetuates profit maximisation, where incentivization happens through the payment as a result of a particular technology or product or what have you. There's a payment in response to that. That payment buys us food, shelter, and anything over and above that we want. That is the design of the system which has been spreading around the world through capitalism. Now, that metering also extends to the smart meters, which we're seeing right now. This is all part of smart cities technologies. There's issues of the electromagnetic pulse, issues of DNA damage with 5G, depression, cancer. These are all the same things where the well-being and the health of the humans is not a consideration. What I said in my previous video was the human suffering that I was sensing that is completely ignored. Targeted killings of those who you disagree with is not a democratic response. The lack of oversight through the political process because of corruption and business interests who are paying for access to politicians who are the legislators who make the laws, etc. This is the corruption that needs to be dealt with from a peace perspective, where we go, oh, well, it's business as usual, it's fine. Wink, wink. We used to say wink, wink, nudge, nudge. No one will know. Delete those files. Get in the best cyber experts so that we can cover our tracks. The main objective of the game is to maximise profit. Well, it's not. You're living in community with other human beings. And that's the emotional disconnect that's sending our planet into a spiral. There's huge human suffering that is resulting. And despite viewpoints that there is justification for this violence, there's not. You can make a story up and say that it has to happen and convince yourself it's the right thing, but it's not. If it was your family that were in the firing line, would you say fire? You wouldn't, because you love them. Everyone else loves their own families. We're all families here. Can you emotionally step into the shoes of someone else and imagine how it feels to be an Afghan, an Iraqi, a Syrian, someone in the Balkans through the Yugoslav conflict, Sudan? We can stretch out across the world to all the conflict zones. Imagine you're the terrified child seeing a helicopter gunship, watching a jet go over. There's so much going on in the name of profit. So once we go to free energy, the whole oil oligarchy is gone. And that would have to be, I would think, the next step. And yes, for those who are invested in the smart cities, they want electrical grids. Well, we can't have that. That's coal burning, CO2 burning. We've had endless evidence, and it's 100% peer-reviewed, that we cannot continue with a CO2 future. So why is it being marketed as sustainable when it's not? The world is not all in a cyber reality. You have to step out of that and start to get into the real world, which is all the families, the people who are depending on these systems that you've created. Now, if population has grown out of control, the economic system is to blame for that because of the availability of credit, which has created the conditions of abundance. Human beings, like any species, has populated as a result. There's also the issue of females not having equality. Had women had more control over reproductive rights, they would have had less children had they been educated. So there are lots of ways to come at these problems, but we have to look at social policy. We have to look at how we educate children, not singularly in a STEM type mentality, which is science, technology, engineering and maths, which is actually the very academia that's enabling the weaponization of our world, that's still providing these pathways into industrial outputs, which is not sustainable. No one has significantly changed the model of infinite growth modelling because our profit maximisation depends on volume, or it depends on innovation. Certainly the IT industry would see itself as making trillions out of material objects which really aren't worth much. But because there's a lot of demand for it, because everybody's coming on board and they're upgrading, and you can keep them locked into continual cycles of upgrade and replacement, we're still in the same ecological problem where we are still living out of harmony with the natural world because we are buying, throwing out, disposing of things. We're not keeping them for the entire lifetime. Built-in obsolescence is there, competition is there, the next generation is there, and on it goes on this treadmill that we have not jumped off. So the war in 9/11, the catalyst, this watershed, is really the big flag to unbridled economic growth, that has not got the brakes on because it's lost regulation and it's lost political oversight because of the corruption of humanity, particularly at the highest levels. We have promulgated the mantra of money, profit, this greed, which is an addiction. This is the real addiction. The drugs, in a sense, are a manifestation of the disconnect from the emotional state of well-being. So people can talk about drug addiction, but the real addiction is the addiction to this lifestyle, which is completely out of balance with us. We work way too much. We are not with our families in balance. Families are breaking down. That is going to create massive instability and insecurity. That is where the foundations of conflict arise. So we have massive problems that are being created out of this psychological disconnect from the emotional intelligence of humanity. The inequality of men and women is part of that. The objectivization of life is trained into us, and it's actually wired into the neural networks in the brain. So you literally will see how you're trained. Your brain will wire in accordance with that mental training. That's why the patterning of children is extremely important in early childhood. I did try to bring in social emotional intelligence at the early childhood level before I had a bullying incident, which pretty much set aside my future. I also ended up homeless because I asserted my rights to equality. So my little tiny microcosm of the macrocosm is really, I believe, the human condition where it's going. People are going to have to speak up for their rights as they dismantle the rights in order to control more. The control comes from a basis of fear, the fear of loss of control, the belief that our identity is attached to what we do, not who we are, the perpetual treadmill of economics that is not serving humanity. It's not serving the earth. And because we've been so locked into these power structures, the oil oligarchy, the militarism are just a simple aspect of that. It's why we can't change. It's because of the power dynamics. It's ultimately going to be, I think, the public that are going to change everything when they finally get to a point of going, no more. That will be the 9/11 for those in the elite area when they see that this is not going to manifest. And then they will find, once the dust settles, that really where they were going was not really where they wanted to go. They too are also going to have an awakening that they are like us. We're all the same. We're all in it together. And wiping each other out is not going to serve you or your interests. Saving each other is, and I'm feeling, isn't it funny, a biblical reference is coming to me, is the resurrection, is the word that came to me. It is. Saving each other. It is the love, actually, that sets us all free. That's the emotional intelligence. It opens the heart. It gives you the access to the very thing you think you want. We're all mirrors of each other. So I'll leave it there, but I'm coming into the next video to talk about some whistleblowers. Susan Linder, who is a whistleblower on 9/11. I'm going to talk about her. I'm also going to talk about Donald Trump and other subject matter as well, and other whistleblowers. And I'm also going to do another section on the detainees and what happened to them at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And I'm also going to look at this idea of killing civilians. 9/11 was a mass murder. There needs to be war crimes. And I just want to stay at the end here before I finish. I had a look at death row in the United States because they believe in the death penalty. Majority of cases were in Texas, I noticed, people waiting. Now, these people were waiting for their execution for killing a person. Now, do those beliefs still apply to those in power who have also been involved in massive war crimes? I wonder how they would feel sitting on death row in what they've done. One rule for one group, one rule for another. No one is above the law, and nor should they be. I personally don't believe in the death penalty. I think it's a draconian, backward approach to, certainly you can't rehabilitate someone, and it's certainly making the statement they're non-rehabilitatable. I don't think that's true. I think if you go into people's histories, you'll understand why they do what they do. And that's including those at the very top as well. So we have to get it right on how we educate, how we socialise people, how we treat people. The human rights of people matters. The feminine, masculine, as I said, without going on too long. You get the picture. So I'll leave it there, and on the next video, I'll talk more about those subject matters. Thanks for listening and watching. Bye.